So political labels can get thrown around a lot. We hear communist, socialist, radical, liberal, conservative, patriot, all of these things. And sometimes those words, genuinely help us understand, the nature of politics. But sometimes they're used less to explain and more to like increase a degree of alarm. And here recently, President Trump has used the word communist quite often. The Reuters was reporting like 81 times in 2 weeks. And he's been using it to describe Democratic opponents and then also progressive candidates as we lead up to the midterms. So now's probably a good time to kind of slow down and ask another civics question. And this one's kind of more vocabulary based, and it's, you know, what does communism actually mean? Well, communism is a political and economic ideology that calls for a classless society where means of production are commonly owned, not owned by the government, that they are owned in common. And that phrase, means of production, means that the major resources and institutions used to produce goods and wealth, like factories and land and different industries and infrastructure and capital, or the funds, the money, the wealth behind it. In communist theory, private ownership of those major productive resources would be abolished. You'd have class divisions that would disappear, and society would be organized around common ownership. So, in practice, 20th century communist governments often became one party states with centralized control over politics, the economy, speech, labor, and just public life in general. So, if you look at some examples like the Soviet Union and Maoist China, Cuba, North Korea, and then there's some other communist systems sprinkled in there, they created real historical fears for a lot of people, especially people whose families who lived under those particular governments. So, the word communism carries a great deal of historic weight, and it's not just an insult. It refers to a specific ideology with a serious and often painful history. And so here we are, and this is why accuracy is important, why it matters. If a politician supports higher taxes on wealthy people, that's not automatically communism. If someone supports universal health care, that is not automatically communism. If you have someone that supports stronger labor protections, public education, social security, Medicare, food assistance, public libraries, or government regulation of businesses, that is not automatically communism. Those may be more liberal policies. You may have more progressive policies that are social democratic policies, welfare state policies, or just simply, policy choices that happen to exist within a capitalist democracy. But they're not the same thing as abolish private property, ending capitalism, or establishing common ownership of the means of production, or even creating a one-party communist state. Now, that does not mean every proposal is good. Citizens can do things like, we live in a republic. We argue about taxes, about spending, about healthcare, about regulation, about the proper size and the rule of government. And they can also argue about whether a policy is wise, affordable, constitutional, or even fair. That all those things are completely normal within a republic. But calling every public policy we dislike communism makes the debate worse, not better, because it blurs some really important distinctions. Now, what happens is it makes the citizenry, the citizens, less informed. It turns political disagreement into more about fear. And it also makes it harder to recognize actual authoritarianism when it appears. So, there is a real difference between socialism, democratic socialism, social democracy, and communism. Those words are related in history, historically, but they are not identical in their meaning. Socialism itself, it refers to some form of public, collective, or social ownership of major economic resources. Democratic socialism generally argues that socialist goals should be pursued through democratic politics rather than one party dictatorship. Social democracy usually keeps a capitalist economy, but supports stronger regulation, labor protections, public services, and a social safety net. Communism is more radical because it points towards the abolition of class divisions and private ownership of the means of production. And all of those distinctions are important because a country can have public schools and still be capitalist. A country can have Social Security and still be capitalist, or Medicare and be capitalist. A country can have strong unions, public roads, unemployment insurance, food safety regulations, and can still remain capitalist. The United States has had all kinds of government programs while maintaining and remaining a market-based capitalist country with that type of economy. This doesn't mean that government programs are automatically good, though. It simply means they are not automatically communist. Now, of course, this is not a new problem in American history. During the Red Scare after there was a Red Scare after World War I, and again when the Red Scare came back again under McCarthyism and during the Cold War after World War II, you had accusations of communism that were often used to identify real ideological opponents, but also to smear people like labor organizers, civil rights activists, teachers, artists, writers, government employees, and also just political critics. And sometimes there were espionage concerns here, real espionage concerns, especially in light of the creation of the atomic bomb or the hydrogen bomb. But sometimes the label was used so broadly, it became a weapon against any type of dissent or disagreement. Now, that history should make us more careful then in our use of words. A republic needs citizens who can debate policy without turning every opponent into an enemy of the country. And words matter because they shape how we think. Now, if communist simply means someone to my left, then the word has stopped explaining anything. It's become just a substitute for any type of reasonable argument. So the real civics question is not whether citizens should criticize political ideas, because they should. The real question is whether we are using accurate language when we do it. If a proposal is too expensive, then say that. If it gives government too much power, then say that. If it's unconstitutional, then explain why. It would mean that we weaken markets or limit freedoms or create bad incentives, then make that your argument. But if it's not actually communism, calling it communism does not make the criticism stronger. It just makes the vocabulary weaker. And so, putting the fries in the bag here, what does communism actually mean? It's not just any government program. It's not just progressive taxation or public services or a politician you dislike. Communism is a specific political and economic ideology that's centered on common ownership of the means of production and the abolition of class-based capitalism. The United States should be able to debate left, right, liberal, conservative, progressive, socialist, capitalist ideas. They should be able to argue all of those things and debate those things honestly, because honest debate requires honest language. And today, I thought that was another civics question worth asking. Thanks a bunch. Catch you on the next one.